He thought he knew his airline inside and out, until one flight changed everything. When this undercover CEO saw how a black passenger was treated at the gate, he froze. What he did next sent shockwaves through the entire company, and exposed a truth no one was ready for. The hum of conversations and the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases filled the air at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Under the bright overhead lights, travelers shuffled through security lines, checked departure boards, and rushed toward their gates. Among them was Michael Carter, blending in effortlessly with the evening crowd. Dressed in a casual blazer and slacks, Michael didn't stand out as the CEO of Skyglide Airways. That was intentional. He had built his career on understanding his company from the ground up, preferring to see things as they were, not as they were presented in polished reports. Tonight was one of those nights, an unannounced visit to observe how Skyglide operated when no one knew he was watching. As he approached Gate B19, he slowed his pace, casually glancing at the boarding process. A line had formed in front of the counter, passengers waiting as the airline staff scanned their tickets one by one. Everything seemed routine at first, until the mood around the gate shifted. A man at the front of the line, dressed in a well-pressed button-down and dark jeans, stood with his passport in hand. His expression was calm at first, but as he exchanged words with the gate agent, frustration crept into his face. "I don't understand," the man said, his voice controlled but firm. "I just flew last week using the same passport. There shouldn't be a problem." The agent, a woman with her hair tied back in a tight ponytail, tapped at her keyboard before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but your documents aren't clearing the system. I can't let you board at this time." Michael took a step closer, watching. The man, who the boarding screen confirmed was David Cole, was holding a valid Skyglide boarding pass. "Is there any way to verify?" David asked. The agent, whose name tag read Rebecca Mills, exhaled sharply. "I've checked twice already. There's nothing I can do." David glanced behind him, aware of the growing line. Some passengers sighed impatiently, while others looked on with mild curiosity. Michael, however, noticed something else. A man in a navy sports coat stepped forward next. "Evening," the man said, handing over his passport with a polite nod. Rebecca barely glanced at his documents before scanning his boarding pass. Within seconds, the machine beeped, and she waved him through with a practiced smile. Michael frowned. He had seen both passports. They looked identical in format, yet one was denied while the other was approved without hesitation. David turned toward the man who had just been let through. "Excuse me, but what just happened? He has the same type of passport as I do." Rebecca's posture stiffened. "Sir, I need you to step aside. You're holding up the line." By now, a few murmurs had spread through the waiting passengers. Some exchanged looks, while others quietly observed. Michael had seen enough. With a measured step, he moved forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Can you explain why Mr. Cole was denied boarding, but the gentleman after him was allowed through without issue?" Rebecca blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Sir, Michael held up a hand. "You checked both their passports, correct? What exactly disqualified his but not the other?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Rebecca's face before she straightened her shoulders. "It's a system issue," she said quickly. "It flagged his document, so I can't override it." Michael didn't move. He studied her reaction, the defensive stance, the way she avoided direct eye contact. The tension at the gate had shifted. A few people had taken out their phones, recording discreetly. Rebecca glanced to the side, as if searching for support. The silence stretched between them. Michael met her gaze, calm but unwavering. "Let's get some clarification, then." Rebecca hesitated. The moment stretched, charged with anticipation. A murmur spread through the waiting passengers, a low hum of unease growing louder with each passing second. Some exchanged uncertain glances, while others raised their phones, angling their screens to record the unfolding dispute. David Cole stood his ground, his expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He held up his passport, his grip firm but steady. "I need an actual reason," he said, his voice measured but unyielding. "What exactly is wrong with my documents?" Rebecca Mills, the gate agent, tightened her jaw. "Sir, I've already explained." "No, you haven't. David cut in. His patience was clearly thinning. You just keep repeating that my passport isn't clearing the system. That doesn't tell me anything. A few people in the crowd muttered in agreement. The tension at the gate had shifted from mild curiosity to open concern. Michael Carter, still standing among the waiting passengers, observed carefully. He noted the rigid set of Rebecca's shoulders, the way her fingers hovered near her keyboard without actually pressing anything. He could see it, hesitation, the struggle to maintain authority in a moment slipping out of her control. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. Let's go ahead and verify that system issue. Shall we? Rebecca's eyes flickered toward him, irritation flashing across her face before she masked it with professional restraint. Sir, this is a private matter between the passenger and Skyglide Airways. Michael didn't move. I'm sure it is, he said, which is why I'd like to make sure our procedures are being followed correctly. Before Rebecca could protest, a new voice entered the conversation. Is there a problem here? A tall, broad-shouldered man in an airport security uniform approached the counter. His name tag read Mark Peterson. He looked from Rebecca to David, then at the small crowd forming behind them. Rebecca exhaled, relief evident. This passenger's documents aren't clearing the system, she said quickly. I've already checked twice. Mark nodded and turned to David. Let's take another look. He reached for the passport, scanning it into his own system. Seconds passed. The machine beeped. Mark's brows furrowed slightly. He glanced at Rebecca. His passport is fine. There's no issue. Silence stretched between them. Rebecca's fingers twitched. Michael watched the color drain slightly from her face. He could sense the shift, the quiet unraveling of whatever excuse she had been relying on. Rebecca, he said, his voice even. If his passport is fine, then what's the actual issue here? Rebecca inhaled sharply, her expression tightening. Sir, we follow standard security procedures. Certain risk factors. What risk factors? Michael pressed. Rebecca hesitated, then squared her shoulders. We are trained to identify potential concerns. Sometimes, there are indicators that warrant additional screening. Michael let the weight of her words settle. Around them, the murmurs of the passengers grew louder. Indicators, he repeated. You mean like the fact that he's a black man? Rebecca stiffened. That's not. Mark Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Look, let's not jump to conclusions. There might have been a misunderstanding. Michael ignored him. His focus remained on Rebecca. Let me ask you this, he said. Did you check the system when the man after him presented his passport? Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it. You didn't, did you? Michael's tone was steady, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. You let him board without a second glance. But this man, you decided needed extra scrutiny. A ripple of agreement ran through the watching crowd. A woman near the front shook her head, whispering something to her husband. Another passenger muttered, "This is ridiculous." Rebecca's face flushed. "I was just following." Following what? Michael's voice cut through the noise. A gut feeling? A policy that doesn't exist? She faltered. For the first time, her confidence cracked. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID badge. He held it up for her to see. The Skyglide Airways logo gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "My name is Michael Carter," he said. "I'm the CEO of this airline. And I want to know why my employee decided to deny a paying customer the right to board his flight based on nothing but her own bias." The crowd reacted instantly. A few gasps. A couple of people exchanging wide-eyed glances. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Rebecca's expression turned blank. She took a step back as if the revelation physically unsettled her. Michael let the silence sit between them before speaking again. "I'm going to ask you one last time," he said. "Why did you deny Mr. Cole the right to board?" The air was thick with anticipation. Rebecca's gaze darted to Mark Peterson as if looking for a way out. When none came, she swallowed hard. I thought it was a risk," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Certain passengers require extra screening. It's not personal." Michael's jaw clenched. "You're suspended," he said, his voice firm, effective immediately. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Wait, I'll have someone take over for you. You are no longer authorized to work this gate, nor any other, until a full investigation is conducted." Mark Peterson straightened, nodding in agreement. Michael turned toward David Cole. "I sincerely apologize for what just happened," he said. "This should have never occurred. And I will personally make sure it doesn't happen again." David met his gaze, his frustration still evident, but there was something else there too, relief. A woman near the back of the crowd spoke up. "Does this happen a lot?" Before Michael could respond, another voice cut in. "Excuse me, sir." A young woman in business attire, holding a microphone, stepped forward. The small logo on her badge read ALC News. "I just witnessed everything that happened," she said. "Would you be willing to comment on what we just saw?" Michael exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. By sunrise, the internet had already decided. What had started as a tense exchange at Gate B19 had turned into a national conversation. The video, grainy but unmistakably clear in its message, showed Michael Carter standing firm, demanding answers, while Rebecca Mills stammered through weak justifications. Another angle captured the exact moment when Michael revealed his identity, his voice calm but authoritative, as gasps rippled through the waiting passengers. The hashtags were relentless. Skyglide racist policy, justice for David Cole. Within hours, major news outlets had picked up the story, replaying the clip on morning shows, dissecting every word. Some anchors called it a wake-up call for the airline industry. Others speculated on the implications for Skyglide's leadership. But the most damaging part wasn't just the video itself, it was the avalanche of personal testimonies that followed. People flooded social media with their own experiences. Travelers of color recounted stories of being pulled aside for additional screening, denied boarding for vague reasons, or treated differently than their white counterparts. Employees, some still working for Skyglide, hinted at unwritten rules and quiet warnings from management about which passengers required extra attention. By mid-morning, major civil rights organizations had released statements condemning the airline. Legal advocacy groups hinted at potential lawsuits. Skyglide Airways, once a brand associated with luxury and efficiency, now found itself in the crosshairs of public scrutiny. The financial markets responded just as quickly. Skyglide's stock took an immediate dip, not catastrophic but enough to make investors nervous. Analysts warned that if the situation wasn't contained, the airline risked losing lucrative airport contracts and partnerships with corporate travel agencies. Michael barely had time to process it all before his phone rang. The number flashing on the screen was one he knew well, Richard Holloway, chairman of the board. "Michael." Richard's voice was clipped, controlled. "We need to talk." Michael shut his office door and leaned against his desk. "I assume this is about the news cycle?" "Don't play coy," Richard snapped. "You've put this company in a terrible position." Michael let out a slow breath. "I didn't put us in this position, Richard. One of our employees did. And now, we have to decide how we're going to fix it. The way we fix it," Richard said, his tone measured, "is by controlling the message. Damage control. We release a carefully worded statement, apologize for any misunderstandings, and move on." Michael knew that approach well. He had seen corporations do it countless times, a hollow apology, a vague promise of review, and business as usual. It wasn't going to work this time. "I'm not sweeping this under the rug," he said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, Richard's voice dropped into something quieter, almost a warning. "Be careful, Michael. You might think you're fighting for what's right, but you're also putting a lot at risk. The board isn't happy. Some of our biggest partners are watching this very closely. If we lose key contracts, if we lose the trust of the airports we operate in, it won't just be you who suffers, it'll be the entire company." Michael sat down, rubbing his temple. He wasn't naive. He understood the stakes. But he also knew that doing nothing would mean letting the culture at Skyglide continue unchecked. "I'll handle this," he said finally, "but not by pretending it didn't happen. I'm launching an internal investigation. We need to find out if this was an isolated incident or something deeper." Richard let out a sharp laugh. "You really think you're going to clean up an entire corporation overnight?" "No," Michael admitted, "but I can start." Another pause. When Richard spoke again, there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. "Then I hope you know what you're walking into." That was the end of the call. Michael stared at his screen. The news still rolling in. Commentators dissecting every angle. He knew the firestorm wasn't dying down anytime soon. And then, his inbox pinged. The subject line read, "Internal only, confidential." There was no sender name. Just an anonymous address. Michael hesitated for half a second before clicking it open. Inside was a single paragraph. "You're right. This isn't just about one bad employee. Look deeper into Skyglide's passenger screening policies. Start with Project Sentinel." His pulse quickened. This wasn't just a PR crisis anymore. It was something much bigger. Michael sat in his office. The anonymous email still open on his screen. Project Sentinel. The words lingered in his mind, carrying the weight of something far bigger than a single employee's poor judgment. If there was indeed a hidden policy embedded within Skyglide's operational structure, he needed proof, real proof, not just an email from an unnamed source. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When he looked up, Sarah Blake stood in the doorway, her expression tense. Sarah had been with Skyglide for over a decade, working her way up through the ranks in quality control. She was sharp, meticulous, and one of the few people Michael knew he could trust. If she was here now, unannounced, it meant she had something worth saying. "Close the door," she said quietly, stepping inside. Michael complied. "I'm guessing this isn't just a social visit." She exhaled sharply, placing a folder on his desk. "I saw what happened at the airport." She crossed her arms. Rebecca Mills was following an unspoken rule. And she's not the only one. Michael leaned forward. "Go on." Sarah hesitated, glancing at the walls as if making sure they weren't being listened to. Then, in a hushed tone, she said, "We've been training employees to scrutinize certain passengers more than others. Not officially, of course. There's no handbook that says it outright. But over the past few years, subtle directives have been passed down. Internal briefings, guidelines, about identifying potential security risks. The message is always the same: extra screening for certain demographics." Michael clenched his jaw. "And who decided that?" Sarah shook her head. "That's the problem. Orders trickle down, but they never have a clear source. It's always someone enforcing a standard protocol that no one ever put into writing." She tapped the folder she brought. "I pulled what I could from internal training sessions. It's not much, just vague language about risk assessment models, but put together. It paints a pattern." Michael flipped through the documents. There were PowerPoint slides, email chains between mid-level managers, even an old training memo that emphasized enhanced screening for international travelers from specific regions. The wording was cautious, indirect, but he could see it for what it was. "This won't be enough," he muttered. "We need something more concrete." Sarah nodded. "Then you're going to have to go deeper." Michael wasted no time. Within the hour, he had IT run a full report on boarding denials from the last 5 years. When the results came in, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Passengers flagged for document inconsistencies were overwhelmingly Black or Middle Eastern. The rate of denied boardings for these demographics was nearly 3 times higher than any other group. And yet, nearly all of them had been cleared after secondary screening, meaning there had been no real issue to begin with. Michael leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. His phone buzzed. A forwarded email from an employee in operations. The subject line read, "Urgent, unauthorized data request." The email thread below showed a conversation between 2 mid-level managers discussing an internal directive from a higher-up, urging them to ensure compliance with specific passenger screening procedures. One sentence stood out: "Let's clean up the logs before this gets bigger." Michael felt a cold realization settle in. Someone inside the company had already caught wind of his investigation, and they were trying to erase the evidence. He looked up as a shadow appeared in his doorway. Jack Sullivan, Skyglide's head of legal, stood there with a look that was equal parts concern and warning. "We need to talk," Jack said, stepping inside and shutting the door. Michael folded his arms. "I assume you already know why." Jack sighed, taking a seat. "You're making people nervous, Michael." "Good." Michael shot back. "They should be." Jack studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "Look, I get it. You want to fix this. But you're walking into a storm that's bigger than you realize. If you keep pushing, you're going to make some powerful enemies." Michael didn't flinch. "Are you telling me to back off?" Jack hesitated. "I'm telling you to think about the cost. Skyglide is already under fire. Our stock is slipping. Investors are restless. If you keep digging, you could take this company down with you. Michael's jaw tightened. And if I don't? Jack exhaled, rubbing his temple. Then you let this go. We focus on damage control. Maybe make some policy adjustments. Move on. The room fell silent. Michael knew what Jack was really saying. Let it die now, or risk a war. Michael leaned forward. I'm not letting this go. Jack studied him for a long moment. Then sighed. I figured you'd say that. He stood. Then watch your back. Because whoever's trying to erase the evidence, they're not going to stop. Jack left, and Michael turned back to his screen. A new message had just arrived. From Sarah. We have a problem. Someone just tried to delete the entire 5-year denial record. If we don't act fast, we're going to lose everything. The cover-up had already begun. The conference room was unusually silent. Normally, meetings among Skyglide's executive team carried an air of controlled chaos, figures being debated, strategies outlined, power dynamics shifting subtly beneath the surface. But today, as Michael sat at the head of the long, polished table, the only sounds came from the occasional shuffle of papers and the quiet hum of the city skyline beyond the glass windows. Seated across from him was Richard Holloway. His posture relaxed yet unreadable. The chairman of the board had always maintained an air of quiet authority. A man who knew how to command a room without raising his voice. Around them, several department heads had taken their seats, some leaning forward with cautious interest, others sitting stiffly, avoiding Michael's gaze. Michael placed a folder on the table. Let's get straight to it. The data I pulled from our own system shows a disturbing trend. Black and Middle Eastern passengers are being denied boarding at a rate nearly 3 times higher than any other demographic. And yet, nearly all of them pass secondary screening. That means we're flagging them without cause. No one spoke. A few exchanged glances, waiting to see who would be the first to respond. Linda Graves, head of operations, shifted in her seat. Michael, I don't know where you're getting this, but there is no such policy. We train our staff to follow objective security protocols. Michael raised an eyebrow. Then why does the data suggest otherwise? Linda hesitated. Look, sometimes security teams err on the side of caution. We're dealing with evolving threats. If certain profiles align with risk factors. Risk factors, Michael repeated, his voice flat. You mean racial profiling? She flinched at the bluntness of his words. I mean enhanced screening procedures based on behavioral indicators. Michael leaned back, studying her. Tell me, Linda, do those behavioral indicators ever apply to white passengers at the same rate? Silence. Richard Holloway finally spoke, his voice smooth. I think we're missing the bigger picture here. He turned his gaze to the others. What we need to be discussing is damage control. We've already taken a hit in the press. Our stock price is slipping. The longer we let this narrative spiral, the worse it gets. Michael exhaled through his nose. So your concern isn't whether this policy exists. It's whether the public finds out. Richard's smile was tight. My concern is keeping this company stable. He gestured toward the window. Do you know how many airlines have faced lawsuits over similar claims? They pay their fines, issue a few apologies, and move forward. We don't need a crusader. Michael, we need a strategist. Michael folded his arms. Then here's my strategy. We investigate. We own up to what's wrong. We fix it. Richard's gaze darkened, but his tone remained even. And you think that's what's best for Skyglide? I think it's what's right. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Richard's expression. Then, in a move so casual it almost felt rehearsed, he closed the folder Michael had brought, his fingers tapping lightly against its cover. When the meeting adjourned, Richard didn't leave immediately. Instead, he lingered by the doorway, waiting until the others had filtered out before turning to Michael. You're stepping into something much bigger than you realize, he said quietly. Michael crossed his arms. Enlighten me. Richard exhaled, as if debating how much to say. We have arrangements, Michael. Agreements with certain agencies, certain regulatory bodies, security protocols that don't officially exist but ensure smooth operations. Michael's pulse quickened. So we've been cooperating with government profiling? Richard tilted his head. Call it what you want. The point is, if you push too hard, you won't just be taking on Skyglide. You'll be taking on a system that's been in place for years. And trust me, that system doesn't like disruptions. Michael held his gaze. Is that a threat? Richard's lips curled slightly. It's an offer. Walk away from this investigation. And you'll be well compensated. More than well. Keep pushing. And you might find that some doors in this industry start closing for you. Michael felt a slow burn of anger rising in his chest. But he kept his expression neutral. I appreciate the concern, Richard, he said, but I think I'll take my chances. Richard studied him for a moment. Then sighed. I had a feeling you'd say that. He clapped Michael on the shoulder, firm, but not quite friendly. Let's just hope you know what you're doing. With that, he walked away, leaving Michael standing alone in the empty conference room. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the caller ID. Sarah Blake. He answered immediately. Sarah? Her voice came through in a whisper. Urgent and shaken. Michael, someone just accessed our system. They're wiping everything, passenger logs, flagged reports, even internal emails. If we don't stop them now, we're going to lose all of it. Michael felt his stomach drop. Michael didn't hesitate. The moment Sarah's call ended, he grabbed his coat and strode out of his office, his mind already racing through worst-case scenarios. If someone was actively deleting records, it meant they knew he was getting close. And if they were willing to go this far, they wouldn't stop at just erasing data. By the time he reached the lower levels of Skyglide's corporate headquarters, the sterile hum of the data center filled his ears. Rows of server racks blinked with steady lights, each one holding the digital skeletons of the company's operations. Sarah was already there, hunched over a terminal, her fingers moving frantically across the keyboard. They've locked me out, she muttered without looking up. Whoever's doing this is in the system right now. They're wiping logs, emails, passenger screening data, everything. Michael stepped closer, scanning the screen. The deletion process was in motion. Chunks of data vanishing in real time. But it wasn't a chaotic purge. It was precise, targeted. Someone knew exactly what needed to disappear. Can you trace it? He asked. Sarah exhaled sharply. I already did. The command came from an executive-level login. She hesitated, then pointed at the screen. Linda Graves. Michael felt his jaw tighten. Linda had been evasive in the last meeting, but he hadn't expected her to be this deeply involved. I'll handle her, he said. Just tell me you backed up something. Sarah's fingers never stopped moving. I saw this coming, she admitted. I managed to clone part of the data before they locked me out. It's not everything, but it's enough to prove what they've been doing. Michael glanced at her. How bad is it? She pressed a key and brought up an email thread. Bad. The messages were carefully worded but unmistakable in their intent. Internal memos spoke of enhanced screening parameters and passenger risk classification models. All thinly veiled corporate jargon for systemic racial profiling. One email in particular stood out. A subject line read, Sentinel Policy Compliance. Michael skimmed the contents. It outlined an operational directive enforcing stricter screening measures based on preliminary threat indicators. An intentionally vague phrase. The recipients included high-ranking officials in multiple departments. But there was no direct link to Richard Holloway or the board, at least not yet. Sarah pulled up another file. This one's different. I almost missed it because it was buried under encrypted archives. Michael leaned in. The email was older, dating back 6 months. And this time, there was no ambiguity. From Richard Holloway to Linda Graves. Subject: Data cleanup. Linda, we need to be proactive about this. Ensure all flagged logs are reviewed and removed where necessary. We don't want loose ends. Do it before this becomes a problem. Michael stared at the screen. There it was. Direct involvement. Richard had ordered the cover-up himself. Sarah spoke cautiously. This isn't just some discriminatory screening practice. This was built into the company's infrastructure. Whatever Project Sentinel is, it was designed to be permanent. Michael straightened. That means there's more. He turned toward the door. He had an appointment to keep. Linda Graves sat stiffly in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But Michael could see the tension in her posture. The blinds in his office were drawn, the only light coming from the city skyline behind him. Michael placed a printout of the email between them. I'll make this simple, he said. Explain. Linda swallowed. I don't know what you mean. Michael leaned in. Your login credentials were used to wipe company records. That's obstruction, Linda. And now, I have proof that Richard ordered you to do it. Her eyes flickered toward the document. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a controlled breath, she shook her head. I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. Michael countered. Linda hesitated, glancing away. You don't understand, Michael. If I talk, it's not just my job on the line. These people, she exhaled sharply. They don't play fair. If I go against them, they'll ruin me. Michael studied her carefully. She was afraid, but it wasn't just about losing her position. It was deeper than that. He softened his tone. Then help me take them down. She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. You really think you can? Michael tapped the email. I'm already halfway there. Linda closed her eyes for a long moment. Then, finally, she exhaled. I don't know everything, but I do know Sentinel is bigger than just us. Richard isn't acting alone. Michael felt a chill settle over him. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it real. Then let's start with what you do know. Linda hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Michael sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen casting sharp shadows across the room. The evidence was all there, the emails, the flagged screening records, the internal directives hidden under layers of corporate jargon. And now, the smoking gun. Richard Holloway's direct order to erase everything before it could be exposed. He reached for his phone and dialed Jack Sullivan. The head of Skyglide's legal department answered on the third ring, his voice calm but cautious. I need you to review something, Michael said, cutting straight to the point. It's big. A pause. How big? Michael clicked on the file containing the Sentinel documents. Big enough that I need to know exactly how much legal ground we have before I take this public. Jack sighed. This isn't just about compliance violations. Is it? No, Michael admitted. It's about systematic racial profiling. It's about a cover-up that goes straight to the top. Another silence. Heavier this time. Send it over, Jack finally said. But Michael, be careful. If this is as big as you say it is, you won't be the only one making moves. Michael sent the files and leaned back in his chair. He had taken the first step toward exposing Sentinel. But he had no illusions. Richard wouldn't let this go unanswered. By noon, the response came. A formal letter from the board of directors arrived in his inbox. Stamped with urgency. Subject: Emergency board meeting notification. Michael scanned the document. The language was carefully crafted, but the message was clear. He was being accused of violating internal security protocols, mishandling confidential company data, and endangering Skyglide's reputation. At the bottom of the letter, the time for the meeting was set. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. This was Richard's counterattack. Michael exhaled through his nose, closing his laptop. He had one night to prepare for a fight that could cost him everything. The tension in his chest didn't ease as he left the office that evening. He had barely pulled out of the parking garage when he noticed it, a dark sedan, idling too long before falling in line behind him. He changed lanes. So did the sedan. Michael's grip tightened on the wheel. He made an unscheduled turn onto a side street, watching in the rearview mirror. The car hesitated before following. He didn't go home. Instead, he circled the block twice, then pulled into a crowded gas station, parking where the security cameras had a clear view. He sat there for a minute, pretending to check his phone. The sedan lingered down the street, then slowly rolled past. A few minutes later, a text came through. No name, no number. Stop now before it's too late. Michael stared at the screen. Whoever they were, they wanted him to know they were watching. His phone rang again, this time from a familiar name. Sarah Blake. When he answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. Michael, someone broke into my apartment. Michael sat up straight. Are you hurt? No, I wasn't there, but they went through my things. My laptop's gone. And, she stopped, inhaling shakily. They knew exactly what to look for. Michael's mind worked fast. Sarah had been his closest ally in pulling together the Sentinel files. If someone was trying to erase the evidence, she was a target just as much as he was. You need to leave, he said. Go somewhere safe. A hotel, a friend's place. Just don't go home. Sarah hesitated. Michael? Do you think this is Richard? Michael's grip on the phone tightened. I think whoever is behind this isn't just trying to protect their job. They're protecting a system, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep it in place. There was a long silence. Then Sarah exhaled, steadying herself. I'll pack a bag. Michael ended the call and looked out at the darkened street. This wasn't just a corporate battle anymore. This was something else entirely. Michael paced his office, his mind running through the options. He had little time, and he knew it. The board meeting was set. Richard Holloway was moving to push him out, and whoever had broken into Sarah's home had made their message clear. Stop or face the consequences. But he had no intention of stopping. He picked up his phone and called David Cole. David answered after 2 rings. I was wondering when you'd call. Michael could hear the edge in his voice. I need your help. A pause. Then, I figured, what's the plan? I want you to go public. Michael said, your case was the trigger for all of this. If we can get your story out before Richard buries me under legal red tape, we might have a shot at forcing Skyglide to act before they can cover it all up. David hesitated. You know this is going to make me a target, right? Michael exhaled. I know, but I also know you care about making sure this never happens again. A beat of silence. Then David said, all right, I'm in. Michael didn't waste another second. He hung up and dialed another number, Lisa Warren. Lisa was one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. She had exposed corporate fraud at Fortune 500 companies, taken down corrupt executives, and was known for her ability to dig up the truth no matter how deep it was buried. She answered with a clipped, Carter, I assume this isn't a courtesy call. I have something big, he said, something that needs to get out before they can bury it. I'm listening. Skyglide has been running a covert racial profiling program under the name Project Sentinel. I have internal emails, flagged passenger reports, and an order from Richard Holloway himself to wipe the data. Lisa didn't respond for a few seconds. When she did, her voice was sharper. And you're willing to go on record? Yes, Michael said, but we need to move fast. Richard is trying to force me out. And if he succeeds, I lose my leverage. Lisa was silent for another moment, then said, meet me at my office tonight. Bring everything you have. Michael hung up, feeling the first flicker of control returning. He had a plan. Now he just needed to execute it. But Richard had been planning, too. An hour later, Michael's assistant walked in, her face pale. Sir, we just received this. She handed him an official-looking envelope. Michael tore it open and scanned the contents. His stomach clenched. Effective immediately, he was suspended from all executive duties pending a formal review by the board. His access to all internal systems had been revoked. Richard wasn't wasting any time. Michael set the letter down and looked at his assistant. Who delivered this? She hesitated. Jack Sullivan. Michael's jaw tightened. Jack, the company's head of legal, the man he had trusted to review the Sentinel documents, had been the one to personally deliver his suspension. Michael walked out of his office and down the hall. Jack's office door was open. Michael stepped inside without knocking. Jack looked up, unsurprised. I was expecting you. Michael threw the letter onto his desk. Care to explain? Jack sighed, leaning back in his chair. Michael, you know how this works. You went rogue. You dug into things without board approval. You made the company vulnerable to lawsuits. Michael narrowed his eyes. I made the company vulnerable? Or I made Richard vulnerable? Jack didn't flinch. Does it matter? Michael clenched his fists. You were supposed to help me. Jack's voice was calm. I did help you. I kept you from making an even bigger mistake. Michael studied him, looking for the tell, the slight hesitation, the shift in posture, the Jack he knew wouldn't have backed down so easily. Which meant one of two things. Richard had either bought him off or threatened him. Michael leaned forward. What did he offer you? Jack held his gaze but said nothing. That was answer enough. Michael straightened. I hope it was worth it. He turned to leave, but Jack's voice stopped him. Michael, Jack said quietly, if you keep pushing, you're not just going to lose your job. You're going to lose everything. Michael didn't turn around. We'll see. Later that night, as Michael was preparing to meet Lisa, his phone rang. It was Lisa, but when he answered, her voice wasn't the sharp, confident tone he expected. She sounded tense. Michael? I just got an anonymous email. Michael sat up straighter. From who? I don't know. No name. No traceable address. But the attachment, Michael. It's everything. Not just what you sent me. It's the full archive. Internal reports. Deleted logs. Financial records. Whoever sent this, they have access to everything. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. So we have a whistleblower. Lisa hesitated. Or a trap. Michael exhaled slowly. If someone inside Skyglide was feeding them information, it meant there was still someone on his side. But it also meant Richard wasn't the only one playing the game. The conference room of Skyglide Airways was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. The long mahogany table, usually a space for polished corporate discussions, had become a battleground. At one end sat Richard Holloway, exuding his usual air of quiet authority, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Around him were the board members who had aligned themselves with him, their expressions carefully blank. At the other end, Michael Carter took his seat, his gaze steady as he scanned the room. He knew what this was. A power play. A carefully orchestrated attempt to remove him before he could bring everything into the light. But he wasn't going down without a fight. A legal representative stood up. This emergency session has been called to address the allegations against Michael Carter and his recent actions that have impacted Skyglide's operations. The board will discuss, deliberate, and then proceed with a vote regarding his position as CEO. Richard leaned forward, his voice measured. Let's not waste time. The facts are clear. Michael has unilaterally conducted an unauthorized investigation, leaked confidential data, and created a media storm that has damaged our company's reputation. If he continues, we're looking at potential lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and a loss of trust from our key partners. I believe it is in the best interest of Skyglide Airways that he steps down immediately. Michael didn't flinch. You mean it's in your best interest? He countered. Because if I stay, people are going to learn the truth. Richard's expression remained calm, but Michael saw the flicker of irritation in his eyes. The truth? Richard said smoothly. Or your version of it? Let's be clear, Michael. You're accusing this company, this board, of knowingly implementing discriminatory screening practices. Do you have anything more than speculation? Because from where I stand, all you've done is put our airline in a crisis based on nothing but your personal agenda. Michael opened his laptop and projected a file onto the large screen at the end of the room. The board members shifted in their seats as emails, internal memos, and flagged passenger reports filled the display. This is the truth, Michael said, his voice steady. Project Sentinel was a systematic effort to target passengers based on race, using vague security justifications as cover. These aren't my words. These are internal directives, approved and enforced under your leadership. He pointed directly at Richard. A murmur swept through the room. Some board members exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably. Others remained stone-faced, waiting to see how this played out. Michael turned his attention to Linda Graves. Linda, you were responsible for operations. Your name appears on multiple directives related to Sentinel. Do you deny knowledge of this? Linda straightened, her expression carefully controlled. I was following procedures that were already in place. She said, I didn't create them. Michael clicked to another document. This is an email from Richard to you 6 months ago. It explicitly orders you to clean up all flagged logs before this becomes a problem. Are you still saying you had no knowledge? Linda's lips parted slightly, the hesitation clear. She glanced toward Richard, who remained perfectly still. The pressure in the room shifted. A voice from the far end of the table spoke. Linda, do you want to clarify your role in this? It was Eleanor Park, one of the longest-serving board members, known for her no-nonsense approach. Her tone was unreadable, but the weight of her words was heavy. Linda swallowed. She hesitated, then exhaled. I received the email. Yes, but I was acting under orders. I wasn't the decision-maker here. Michael nodded, then turned to the room. This is how it works. Layers of deniability. Directives passed down with just enough ambiguity to protect the people at the top. But you've seen the evidence. You know what's been happening. And now you have to decide if you're going to be complicit or if you're going to fix it. The legal representative cleared his throat. It's time for the vote. The board members cast their ballots one by one. The tension in the room was palpable as each vote was recorded. Richard sat with his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. When the final count was tallied, the result was announced. By the slimmest margin, Michael retained his position as CEO. A small but sharp exhale left Richard's lips. He had lost, this round. But Michael could see it in his eyes. This wasn't over. As Michael stood to leave, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A text from an unknown number. "You won this battle, but the war is far from over." Michael slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked out of the boardroom. The press conference was already in full swing when Michael arrived at Skyglide's corporate headquarters. A sea of reporters crowded the entrance. Microphones raised, cameras flashing. On the large screen behind the podium, Richard Holloway stood composed, his expression solemn yet controlled. He was in his element, playing the role of the responsible leader. The voice of reason in a manufactured crisis. Michael pushed through the crowd just as Richard's voice carried over the speakers. "Our company has always been committed to integrity," Richard said smoothly, pausing just long enough to let the words settle. "But recent events have raised serious concerns about internal misconduct." A murmur spread through the journalists. Michael clenched his jaw, already knowing where this was going. Richard continued, "It has come to our attention that certain individuals, namely, our CEO, Michael Carter, have engaged in unauthorized activities, including the manipulation of internal data and the leaking of confidential company information." Michael inhaled slowly, keeping his face unreadable. The reporters weren't just eating it up, they were waiting for blood. A voice called out from the crowd, "Are you saying Carter fabricated evidence?" Richard made a show of hesitating, then sighed, "I won't speculate on intent. But what I can say is that Skyglide has always operated within legal and ethical boundaries. If Mr. Carter has acted inappropriately, the board will take the necessary steps." The implication was clear. Richard wasn't just attacking Michael's credibility, he was setting the stage for his removal. This time under the guise of corporate responsibility. A second reporter spoke up. "Does this mean Skyglide will take legal action against him?" Richard gave a practiced look of regret. "That will depend on the findings of our internal review." Michael didn't need to hear more. He turned away, his mind already working through the damage control he'd need to do. Back in his office, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The board had already been divided. Now, Richard was turning public opinion against him. The pressure was mounting from all sides, customers threatening boycotts, investors growing nervous, and the media fanning the flames. Then came the real blow. A confidential memo surfaced from an anonymous source, circulating among Skyglide's top shareholders. It accused Michael of reckless decision-making, of jeopardizing the airline's partnerships, of dragging the company into controversy for personal gain. Richard had clearly sent it, and it was working. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You can't win this fight alone. Meet me." Attached was an address. The diner was a hole in the wall spot off the highway. The kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Michael stepped inside, scanning the booths. Then he saw her, Lisa Warren. She raised an eyebrow as he slid into the seat across from her. "Rough morning?" Michael exhaled. "You could say that." Lisa pushed a folder toward him. "This might make your day worse." He opened it, scanning the contents. His pulse quickened. Witness testimony, internal documents, financial reports, and at the center of it all, Jack Sullivan. Michael looked up. "Jack gave you this?" Lisa nodded. "He reached out to me last night. Said he wanted to make things right." Michael frowned. "The same Jack Sullivan who stood by Richard, who delivered my suspension notice." "The same," Lisa confirmed. "Said he finally realized how far Richard was willing to go. He's willing to go on record." Michael leaned back. Jack had been Richard's legal shield for years. If he was flipping now, it meant one of two things. Either his conscience had finally caught up with him, or he knew the ship was sinking and wanted off before it dragged him down. Either way, it was an opportunity. Lisa tapped the papers. "There's more. Jack says Sentinel isn't just a Skyglide operation. It has ties to federal agencies." Michael's stomach tightened. "Government involvement?" She nodded. "According to Jack, some of Sentinel's screening protocols were developed in collaboration with national security programs. If this gets out, it won't just be Skyglide under fire. It'll be people in Washington, Michael let out a slow breath. This wasn't just corporate corruption anymore. This was systemic. Lisa watched him carefully. So, what's your move? Michael stared at the folder. He had two choices. Use the evidence now, go public, and take Richard down immediately, risking a larger backlash from forces beyond just Skyglide. Or hold onto it, wait for the right moment, and play a longer game, one that could expose not just Richard, but the entire network behind Sentinel. His fingers tightened around the folder. This wasn't just about Skyglide anymore. Michael sat across from Lisa Warren and Jack Sullivan in a dimly lit corner of a quiet cafe. A world away from the chaos swirling around them. The air smelled of burnt coffee and the faint trace of old newspapers. A stark contrast to the storm that was brewing outside these walls. Lisa had her notebook open, tapping her pen rhythmically against the table. Jack, the former legal enforcer of Skyglide, now a reluctant whistleblower, stirred his untouched drink, his eyes shadowed with something between regret and resolve. Michael placed the folder between them. If we go public now, we risk losing control of the narrative. Richard will twist this before we even get a chance to explain it. Lisa nodded. It's what I'd do if I were him. Jack leaned forward. That's not the only problem. If Sentinel really has ties to federal agencies, blowing the lid off this won't just hurt Skyglide, it'll attract attention from people with far more power than Richard Holloway. Michael exhaled slowly. So, what are you saying? Jack hesitated. I'm saying you need to be prepared for more than just corporate backlash. The people behind Sentinel won't just let this unravel. If you push too fast, too hard, they'll make sure you never get the chance to finish what you started. Lisa clicked her pen. So, what's the alternative? Michael stared at the folder. Two choices, two paths, both dangerous. Option 1. Go public now. Take everything to the media. Expose Richard. And force Skyglide into a full-blown crisis. The risk? Sentinel's true masterminds wouldn't let it happen without a fight. If this went high enough, it could turn into a federal matter, and Michael had no idea what kind of damage that could bring. Option 2. Gather more evidence. If they could get federal oversight involved first, it would be harder for Richard to spin the narrative. But that meant going slow, playing the long game, and making sure they had allies in the right places before pulling the trigger. Lisa watched him carefully. So, what's it going to be? Michael looked up. We go to the FAA first. Jack let out a breath of relief. That's the smart move. Lisa closed her notebook. Then let's move fast. But Richard had been moving. 2. Less than 24 hours later, an internal report leaked to the press, alleging that Michael himself had been manipulating Skyglide's security protocols. The accusations were clear. He had personally interfered with sensitive operational data, allegedly deleting security reports and compromising passenger safety. Michael sat in his office, staring at the printed report in front of him. It was masterfully done, vague enough to avoid outright slander, but damaging enough to raise suspicion. His assistant knocked hesitantly. Sir, some board members are asking if you plan to step down. Michael looked up sharply. Step down? They're worried, she said. Richard is using this to push for an emergency vote. If enough members turn against you, you might not get another chance. Michael clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about corporate infighting anymore. Richard was building his final case, laying the groundwork for Michael's complete removal. He picked up his phone and dialed. The Federal Aviation Administration's Washington office was a fortress of bureaucracy, but Michael had managed to get a direct line to someone who could make a difference. Hannah Pierce, a senior investigator in the FAA's regulatory division, picked up on the second ring. I assume you're calling about Skyglide, she said, skipping pleasantries. Michael didn't waste time. I have documents proving the company has been using racially targeted screening methods under the guise of security. The operation is called Project Sentinel. There was a pause. Then Hannah said, send me what you have. Michael hesitated. I need assurances. This can't disappear into a black hole. Hannah's voice was steady. If what you have is real, I'll make sure it doesn't. But understand this. Once this moves forward, there's no turning back. Michael exhaled. I know. He ended the call and sent the files. 2 hours later, his phone rang again. A blocked number. He answered cautiously. Carter. A deep voice, unfamiliar and calm, came through the line. You don't know what you're getting into. Michael stiffened. Who is this? You think you're fighting a corrupt CEO. The voice continued. But you're stepping into something much bigger. If you keep pushing, you won't just lose your job. A pause. You'll lose everything. The call went dead. Michael stared at the phone in his hand. The war had just escalated. The tension in the room was thick. The kind that made the air feel heavy. Reporters filled every seat. Their cameras poised. Their microphones angled forward. The world was waiting for Michael Carter to speak. Michael stood behind the podium, hands gripping its edges. He had been through boardroom battles, legal threats, and intimidation tactics. But this was different. This was war in the open. And the stakes were higher than ever. Lisa Warren sat near the front, her notepad resting on her lap, eyes sharp as she tracked every movement. She had spent years exposing corruption. But even she knew that today wasn't just about corporate malpractice. It was about power. Who had it? Who controlled it? And who was about to lose it? Michael cleared his throat. The murmuring in the room died down instantly. Skyglide Airways has betrayed the trust of its passengers, its employees, and the public. He began. For years, this company has systematically targeted individuals based on race under the guise of security measures. This was not an accident. It was deliberate, and it was covered up by those in power. Flashes went off. The room shifted. The tension thickened. I have proof. Michael continued. Emails, internal memos, financial records that show exactly who was involved. And today, I am making them public. Lisa nodded slightly. That was her cue. She tapped her phone screen, sending the files to every major news outlet in the country. Within seconds, the headlines started rolling in. Skyglide CEO exposes racial profiling scheme. Whistleblower documents reveal secret passenger screening program. Corporate cover-up linked to high-ranking executives. Michael watched the reporters react in real time. Some scrolling through the documents on their phones. Others whispering to their colleagues. He had just set fire to the entire system. But Richard Holloway had made his move first. 15 minutes before the press conference, the FBI had stormed Skyglide's headquarters. Michael had barely reached his office when two agents stepped inside. One was tall and broad-shouldered. The other shorter, but with sharp, calculating eyes. Their badges flashed. Michael Carter? The taller agent asked. Michael nodded. You need to come with us. The agent continued. We have questions regarding your involvement in the unauthorized access and distribution of classified company data. Michael stiffened. This is a setup. We're just here to investigate. The agent replied smoothly. If you have nothing to hide, there shouldn't be a problem. Michael clenched his jaw. He knew the game. They weren't here for the truth. They were here to delay him, to shut him down before he could go public. And there was only one person powerful enough to pull the FBI into a corporate scandal this fast. Richard. At his own press conference, Richard stood behind a sleek podium, his expression grave. The background was carefully staged, an American flag, the Skyglide logo, and a banner that read, Restoring Trust in Aviation. I regret to inform you, Richard said smoothly, that our company has been the victim of a malicious attempt to manipulate information and mislead the public. A murmur spread through the crowd. The individual responsible for this, Richard continued, is none other than our now suspended CEO, Michael Carter. The words hit like a bombshell. Richard sighed, shaking his head with well-rehearsed disappointment. Michael violated company policy. He compromised sensitive data. And worst of all, he has attempted to frame his own colleagues to shift the blame. More flashes, more whispers. To ensure transparency, Richard concluded, I have personally invited federal investigators to review this matter thoroughly. He had flipped the script. Now, Michael wasn't the whistleblower. He was the villain. Michael sat in the FBI interrogation room, watching the agents across from him. They were good, calm, professional, but he could see it, the hesitation in their eyes. They knew something wasn't right. Then the door opened. Jack Sullivan walked in, followed by Sarah Blake. Michael's heart pounded. Tell me you have something. Jack dropped a thick folder onto the table. I have everything. Sarah pulled out a flash drive. And it's already been uploaded to multiple sources. There's no stopping it now. Michael exhaled. Then let's finish this. Across the country, The media firestorm ignited. News anchors scrambled to report on the leaked files. Social media erupted with outrage. And most importantly, government officials started making calls. A member of the Skyglide board, long aligned with Richard, suddenly found himself in an impossible position. In a desperate bid to save himself, he flipped. Live on air, he provided a statement. "I can no longer remain silent." Richard Holloway was directly involved in the execution of this program, and he misled not only the public but his own employees. The press conference was interrupted with breaking news. Federal inquiry launched into Skyglide's discriminatory practices. Richard Holloway under investigation for financial misconduct. Michael walked out of the FBI building a free man. Just in time to stand before the cameras once again. He took a deep breath and faced the world. The truth always finds its way to the surface. The fallout from Michael's press conference had shaken the entire industry. News anchors dissected every detail. Government agencies scrambled to contain the damage. And the public was outraged. Skyglide Airways was no longer just an airline, it had become the epicenter of a national scandal. The morning after the press conference, the White House press secretary addressed the media, confirming that the federal government would launch a full-scale investigation into Skyglide's racial profiling practices. The FAA issued an emergency review of all airline security protocols. And the Department of Justice hinted at possible civil rights violations. Meanwhile, Skyglide's stock price had gone into free fall. Investors panicked. Customers canceled their flights. The airline's reputation, once untouchable, was now crumbling by the hour. Inside Skyglide's headquarters, Richard Holloway watched the chaos unfold from his office. His jaw clenched. The empire he had spent years building was slipping from his grasp. The boardroom was in turmoil. Richard had summoned every ally he had left. 11 board members sat around the long conference table, their faces drawn with tension. They had backed him for years, trusting his leadership, but now they saw the walls closing in. "We need to act now," Richard said, his voice sharp. "Michael Carter has turned this company into a disaster zone. If we don't take control, Skyglide will go under." A few members nodded, but most avoided his gaze. The fear in the room was palpable. One of them, a senior director named Philip Grayson, cleared his throat. "Richard, the DOJ is involved now. This isn't just corporate damage control. There are criminal implications." Richard waved off the concern. "We can still get ahead of this. If we sell Skyglide to a competitor, the legal liabilities become their problem. We walk away with clean hands." Then Eleanor Park, the longest-serving member of the board, leaned forward. "And what happens when they find out you were the one who authorized Project Sentinel?" Richard's eye twitched. "That's just speculation." Eleanor slid a folder across the table. "No, Richard, that's evidence." He flipped it open, his pulse accelerating. Bank transactions, internal memos, a timeline of decisions that led straight to him. The silence in the room deepened. Eleanor folded her hands. "It's over." Richard's fingers curled into fists. "You think I'm just going to step aside?" A new voice entered the room. "No, Richard," Michael said as he stepped inside. "You're going to be removed." Michael walked to the head of the table, placing another folder in front of Richard. "You thought you could spin this into a personal attack against me," Michael said, his tone calm but firm. "You thought you could buy time, shift blame, maybe even sell the company before the truth caught up to you." Richard glared at him but said nothing. "But here's the problem," Michael continued. "You didn't just approve Project Sentinel. You stole from this company while doing it." Murmurs rippled through the room. Michael gestured toward Lisa Warren, who was sitting near the back of the room. "With the help of an independent investigative team, we traced multiple offshore accounts tied to shell companies that, surprise, lead right back to you." Lisa nodded. Tens of millions siphoned from Skyglide's security budget, routed through dummy corporations. And guess who the final beneficiary was? Michael leaned in slightly. "You." The boardroom fell deathly quiet. Richard's mouth tightened. "This is a smear campaign. None of that will hold up in court." Michael gave a small, knowing smile. "That's funny, because as of 10 minutes ago, every document, every bank transaction, and every email thread proving your involvement was sent to the FBI." Richard's face paled. The board members shifted. Some looked relieved. Others looked horrified. Then Philip Grayson stood. "I move that we immediately vote to remove Richard Holloway as CEO and chairman of Skyglide Airways." A few seconds of hesitation. Then hands went up, one after another. The final count. Unanimous. Richard was done. As Michael left the boardroom, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A group of FBI agents entered the building, their badges flashing. They moved with purpose, heading straight for the boardroom. By the time Michael stepped into the lobby, he saw the scene unfolding live on the news. Cameras captured the moment as Richard Holloway was led out of Skyglide's headquarters in handcuffs. His expression was a mask of fury and disbelief, his downfall playing out in real time for the entire world to see. Lisa stood next to Michael, arms crossed. "That's one hell of a picture." Michael nodded. "It's not over yet." She glanced at him. "You mean the government angle?" Michael's jaw tightened. Richard was powerful, but he wasn't the mastermind. Sentinel was bigger than him. Someone gave the green light. Someone higher up. Lisa exhaled. "And you think they'll just let this go?" Michael shook his head. "No, they wouldn't." The boardroom was quieter than Michael had ever heard it. No raised voices, no power plays, just a room full of executives waiting for him to make a decision. He stood at the head of the table, looking at the faces around him, some relieved, some cautious, and a few still wary. Eleanor Park folded her hands in front of her. "Michael, the company needs stability. Investors are panicking, employees are uncertain, and the public is watching our every move." Philip Grayson nodded. "You're the only one who can restore confidence. If you stay on as CEO, we can begin rebuilding Skyglide." Michael exhaled slowly. It was a tempting offer. He had spent years in this company, fought to build it into something respectable, only to watch it be corrupted from within. Now, with Richard Holloway gone, he had a chance to fix it. But was that enough? Across the table, Lisa Warren sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Michael," she said, "you didn't go through all of this just to put a bandage over a bullet wound. Richard might be gone, but Sentinel isn't. You saw the connections. This goes beyond Skyglide." Sarah Blake, sitting beside Lisa, nodded. "The policies didn't start here. Sentinel was bigger than Richard. If we don't follow this through, it'll happen again somewhere else." Michael's fingers tapped against the edge of the table. He had spent weeks fighting for control of this company. But what if the real battle was still ahead? He took a breath. "I need time to think." Eleanor exchanged glances with Philip before nodding. "Of course, but not too long. Skyglide doesn't have the luxury of waiting." Later that evening, Michael sat alone in his office. The skyline stretched out beyond the glass windows, the city alive with movement. Below, cars rushed through the streets, people moving through their lives unaware of the battles fought in boardrooms and backrooms. His desk was covered with reports, legal documents, and media analyses. The damage control efforts were working, slowly. The stock was stabilizing. Public confidence was fragile but not shattered. He had won the battle inside Skyglide. But was that the battle he wanted? A soft knock at the door. His assistant stepped inside, holding a thick envelope. "This was delivered for you. No return address." Michael frowned, taking it from her. The envelope was heavy, the paper thick. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. "You won a battle, but the real war is just beginning." Michael's jaw tightened. He unfolded another document inside, a list of names. Government officials, corporate executives, people he recognized, people he didn't. At the top, the words Project Sentinel, Phase 2 were printed in bold. His stomach turned. Richard had been powerful, but he was just a piece of something larger, something that hadn't been dismantled. Michael turned toward the window again, gripping the list. He had two choices. He could stay at Skyglide, repair the damage, and walk away from the fight. Or he could take the list, follow the trail, and expose the real masterminds behind Sentinel, no matter the cost. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his decision was made. The aftermath of the scandal had left Skyglide Airways in a state of upheaval. The once dominant airline, known for its seamless operations and pristine public image, was now under relentless scrutiny. Government regulators had imposed strict oversight. Shareholders demanded reforms. and customers remained skeptical despite the company's promises of change. Inside corporate headquarters, the executive team scrambled to clean up the wreckage. Policies were rewritten, internal investigations expanded, and entire departments were overhauled. Employees who had played a role in Project Sentinel were quietly dismissed or placed under review. The culture of secrecy that had enabled discrimination for years was being dismantled. Piece by piece. Among the company's biggest gestures of goodwill was a formal apology to David Cole. Skyglide executives invited him to meet with their leadership team, not just as a symbolic act, but with a genuine offer. He was asked to become an independent consultant, helping the airline reshape its policies to ensure fair treatment of all passengers. David hesitated at first. The anger he had felt that night at the airport, the humiliation of being singled out for no reason beyond the color of his skin, still lingered. But after speaking with Michael, he made his decision. If I can help make sure this never happens to anyone else, David said, then I'll do it. Meanwhile, Richard Holloway sat inside a federal holding facility, his world collapsing around him. The charges against him were extensive: corporate fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations. Prosecutors were prepared to seek the harshest penalties possible, setting an example for other corporate leaders who thought they were untouchable. His attorneys attempted to negotiate a deal. Richard was willing to talk, to give up names, to expose others if it meant reducing his sentence. But there was one problem. The people he would be exposing were far more powerful than he was. And they weren't about to let him talk. 2 days before his first court appearance, Richard was found unconscious in his cell. Official reports labeled it an attempted suicide, but whispers in legal and political circles suggested otherwise. The message was clear. Some secrets weren't meant to be revealed. For Michael Carter, that reality was becoming more apparent every day. Michael sat in his office, staring at the letter of resignation on his desk. He had spent years at Skyglide, building it into a respected airline, only to watch it be tainted by greed and corruption. Now, he had a choice: rebuild the company from within or step away and fight on a broader scale. Lisa Warren and Sarah Blake sat across from him, both waiting for his decision. You don't have to do this, Sarah said. You fought to expose the truth. You saved this company from itself. Michael shook his head. I didn't save it. I just stopped it from sinking further. Lisa leaned forward. Then what's next? Michael exhaled. I can't stay here and pretend that Skyglide is the whole story. Sentinel was just one piece of something much larger. He slid the resignation letter into an envelope. It was done. His time at Skyglide was over. But I'm not walking away, he added. I'm going to build something new. Lisa's eyes narrowed. What kind of something? Michael looked out the window. The city sprawled before him. An organization dedicated to exposing corruption at the highest levels. Not just in aviation, everywhere. A slow smile formed on Lisa's lips. Now that, she said, sounds like something worth fighting for. Just as Michael was preparing to leave his office for the final time, Lisa handed him a sealed folder. This arrived at my office this morning, she said. No return address. Michael opened it cautiously. Inside was a thin stack of documents, marked confidential. The title on the first page sent a chill down his spine. Project Nightfall. What is this? He asked. Lisa crossed her arms. Something bigger than Sentinel. And this time, it's not just airlines involved. Michael skimmed the first few paragraphs. The scope of the project. The names linked it. It was global. He closed the folder and let out a slow breath. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. 1 year had passed since the Skyglide scandal shook the corporate world. The headlines had faded. The public's attention had shifted to new controversies. And most people believed the matter had been settled. But Michael Carter knew better. In the time since his resignation, he had built something new. A team of people dedicated to exposing corruption, unveiling hidden agendas, and holding the powerful accountable. The organization didn't have a flashy name or a public office, but it had the most valuable resource of all: truth. Lisa Warren had left her position as an investigative journalist to join him. Sarah Blake had walked away from the airline industry, determined to ensure that no company would ever get away with what Skyglide had attempted. David Cole, the passenger whose denial of boarding had started everything, had become their bridge to advocacy groups, ensuring their investigations weren't just about corporate crime but also about real people affected by these systems. Together, they had uncovered more than they ever anticipated. Late one evening, Michael sat in their headquarters, a discreet office in a quiet part of Washington, D.C. The walls were lined with files, reports, and whiteboards filled with connections no one else had dared to make. Lisa leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "It's bigger than we thought." Michael rubbed his temples. "It always is." Sarah pulled up a document on her laptop. "We traced the funding behind Project Sentinel. It didn't stop at Skyglide. There's evidence that multiple airline corporations were involved. And it's not just about racial profiling, it's about control. Passenger data, flight patterns, security loopholes. Someone was using the system for something much bigger." Michael exhaled. "Government ties?" Lisa nodded. "More than ties. Some of the same officials who investigated Sentinel were funding parallel operations in international airports." David stepped in, placing a folder on the table. "And that's not the worst of it." Michael flipped it open. Inside were classified documents, banking records, and communication logs. At the top of one page, stamped in bold letters, Michael frowned. "This was mentioned in the files Lisa gave me last year." David tapped the folder. "It's not just about airlines. It's about logistics, supply chains, national security. They were using Sentinel as a test run." Michael's stomach tightened. Sentinel had been devastating enough, a system designed to discriminate and manipulate. If it was only a fraction of something larger, then they weren't just dealing with a corrupt airline anymore. They were up against something global. Later that night, Michael stood on the rooftop of their building, looking out at the Washington skyline. The city was alive, unaware of the battles being fought in its shadows. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A new message. No name, no number. "We need to talk. There's more you don't know." Michael stared at the screen, then looked up at the city again. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The truth isn't always visible from the top. It takes courage to step down, to see the world as it truly is, and to challenge a system built on silence. Michael Carter didn't just expose corruption. He proved that real change starts with those willing to fight for it. But this story is just the beginning. If one company could hide a secret this big, what else is lurking beneath the surface? What do you think? Can one person truly take on an entire system? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind power, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths.